I argued with Mary. Which Mary? The one who's kept captive her whole life in a room where everything is black and white with shades of gray? There she reads black and white books, watches black and white shows on television, and becomes a neuroscientist. She knows everything about the human brain if I ask her what happens in the human brain. When another person looks at the blue sky, she describes everything, even though she herself does not see the color blue, because everything around her is black and white. But she describes the entire flow of neuron discharges to you. When someone looks at the blue sky, it's just that Mary doesn't see that blue. She only sees the other person's neurons. In fact, she has never seen blue being locked in the black and white room, so she doesn't actually know what the color blue looks like. One day, Mary is let outside. When she walks out the door, the first thing she does is look at the sky and say, "Aha, so that's what blue looks like?" Mary learned something new, or rather, she discovered a new quality of the information she gained about the outside world. Mary is a classic example in the world of philosophers, used to describe how our experiences have intrinsic subjective qualities that can only be known by the person themselves from within the mind. The color blue, the taste of an orange, the sound of wind in the forest. These additional qualities, which are discovered only subjectively, are referred to by the generic term qualia. Why is Mary important? Because philosophy argues, using Mary's thought experiment, that the world cannot be fully described only by external physical laws. That is, materialism or physicalism is not the complete explanation of the world. In the world, there are objective perceptions, like two apples, which everyone agrees on. That's science. But also subjective perceptions, which are experienced only by the person who has them. The taste of apples can only be known by the person who tastes them. Another person has to taste them too to find out that taste. They can't know the taste just from a description of an apple. This made me think as I was reading the book Galileo's Error here. The author, Philip Goff, argues that the fundamental problem of materialism is that it does not allow for subjective knowledge within its framework for describing the world. Without preserving it, if it allows Mary to subjectively experience color, materialism will not be able to explain the qualia of color. Just as Mary didn't know what the color blue looked like as long as she wasn't allowed to go outside and see it with her own eyes. While reading the book, I thought I could replace the color blue with circles. If Mary, for example, can only draw straight lines, if all she ever sees are straight lines, she can't imagine circles. And I thought that we are Mary, because we can't imagine four straight lines perpendicular to each other. Because we can't imagine four-dimensional space, we live in a three-dimensional one. We can take an alien whose brain perceives four dimensions. We look at his brain and still can't imagine four lines perpendicular to each other. The question I asked myself is whether Mary's problem is actually well posed. In fact, does this thought experiment really show that physics is incomplete? Or does it just show that there are different ways of processing information in the brain, one from the outside and another from the inside? And then, we can't expect the first to understand the second. A cat can't imagine Maxwell's laws because it has too few neurons. It can't make the necessary connections, even though the cat can play with the Christmas tree lights, just like it does with the yarn. The cat's neurons process information only in the way their neural network was built. In a way, that's the problem of the Chinese room by John Searle. A Romanian clerk, let's say, could manipulate Chinese symbols, always giving the correct answers, without knowing Chinese, without understanding the meaning of the symbols. Kind of like generative pre-trained transformer. And that's what neurons do. They manipulate electrical voltages without knowing what they represent. A neuron reads the electrical voltage from the receptor that received a photon with a wavelength of 400 nm, which would be blue, then passes on the electrical voltage as an electrical discharge to other neurons. Neurons don't know about the information they carry, just like Searle's clerk doesn't know Chinese. So when Mary, the one who stays in the gray room and has never seen colors, looks at someone else's neurons, what else can she find out besides electrical voltages? In order to see blue, Mary has to look at the light herself. Her own neurons need to be involved in processing color information. When Mary looks at someone else's brain, she isn't using this ability, but another one, the ability to visualize the electrical discharges in someone else's neurons. Simply put, to see blue, Mary has to directly use her own ability to see the color blue. She can't use the ability to recognize neural signals in other brains. When Mary looks at the sky and discovers something new, the color blue, she will experience it. Because a capacity she already had before, the ability to subjectively perceive color, was activated, but she wasn't using it. The capacity that made her a good scientist, the ability to objectively perceive numbers and relationships, did not automatically make her able to perceive colors. Mary, who lived in a gray room all her life, studied the neurons of other people who looked at the blue sky, trying to understand what the color blue is. Without seeing it before, she goes outside and sees the blue color of the sky for the first time. Why does Manny see the color? Why couldn't he imagine it before, when he was only looking at the neurons of the other person who was looking at the blue sky? The cat doesn't know Maxwell's laws because it doesn't have the neurons that would make it capable of knowing them, but Mary does. Some special neurons make her see the color blue itself, but only when she looks at it herself, and these neurons are not activated when she looks at another brain. That's why not being able to imagine the color blue without seeing it directly at least once could be a conclusion. However, scientists haven't found any special neurons for this and don't expect them to exist, so it must be something else. What emerges from these ordinary neurons, which are really just a kind of more advanced capacitor actually, what are these recognition abilities of the brain, essentially? Neural networks that discriminate between responses. If I look at grandma, the neural network converges to a group of neurons that activate only when I look at grandma or when I think about her. Otherwise, they are always silent. I think this is almost proven. This ability to recognize, to converge to a response, is present in both animals and humans. In addition, they have also added the language of words. So then, what is Descartes' internal theater, the one in which subjective sensations manifest with Alia? Essentially, a group of grandmother neurons, which we can reduce to one for each type of information, for recognition. A grandmother neuron activates when I see my grandmother, another grandmother neuron when I see the color green, another when I see a circle, and so on. This could be the scene of the inner theater, only these neurons, they are a representation of the external world. We should also add a group of neurons that represent the self, neurons that signal about the body, others that relate autobiographically to memories, and so on. On the stage of the inner theater, we have these two groups of grandmother neurons facing each other, those that represent the external world and those that represent the self, the world of our body. Like in a battle on stage, let's imagine that the two groups are connected to each other through neural connections. And then maybe this is where the miracle happens, the fusion. In this communion, subjective experience is born, Qualia is born. Of course, not all grandmother neurons have to be active. We know that we are not aware of everything around us. Some elements from the external or internal representations of the body and the self, autobiographical, can be ignored. In today's fusion process, sentinel neuron, what is more important is the result of this fusion, the inner world. I like to think that it could be that way, but I don't think it can be. Well, if just the processing of these grandmother neurons would, through fusion, create the inner world that we feel, how would the processing know? That neuron represents a grandmother and not an airplane, since it's just a neuron sending an electrical signal? It seems to me that this special process of fusion should also be extended to the part where the processing of the neural network is initiated. It ends with a global explanation of consciousness, similar to Bernard Barth's theory, which says that the whole brain is the stage of the inner theater, where consciousness only shines the spotlight and brings to light a few of the events happening there. What if those working on artificial intelligence could discover and reproduce these semiotic processes, which would ultimately also produce subjective sensations? But after reading the book Galileo's Error, I'm sure this won't be a materialistic explanation of one, because not even the programmer who discovered that software could explain why. The result of the processing would not only be one decision or another for action, but also the subjective sensation. In the scheme outlined by Philip Goff, the result would fit into naturalistic dualism, meaning that kind of dualism in which subjective sensations have their own laws as well, only that they cannot be described and especially cannot be justified by mathematical or physical laws. There would be other laws. In a universe where both subjective sensation and objective knowledge would have an equal place in what we call the experience of existence, in other words, simply put, life. What did the book Galileo's Error teach me? I became familiar with Mary's problem, a being who lives in a gray room and tries to imagine the color blue. Just by looking at other people's brains, who, unlike her, have access to the blue color of the sky. As long as she lives in that room, she won't succeed, no matter how precisely she measures the neurons in other people. But when she escapes from the room and sees the blue sky, she will discover something completely new to her. What does the color blue look like? What does it mean? That a color, like blue, has something new and subjective in her perception, which is only discovered when it is directly perceived, not described through mathematical models. In other words, Mary's lesson is that descriptive mathematical models have an intrinsic limit. They cannot describe how a taste intrinsically feels, how a color is intrinsically perceived. In the subjective theater of experience, please comment whether you agree or not with this conclusion, that artificial intelligence could also gain subjective sensations when, of course, it processes them with meaning for itself. I hope you enjoyed the topic anyway. There will be more videos on these subjects. Until then, please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already by clicking on this subscribe button. Until next time, I'm Christian Persura. You are cool. I wish you all the best. Goodbye.